this is a heavily Kurdish populated area, and there is a huge amount of distrust between locals and the authorities. And actually, quite a lot of the time, local communities do a lot of their own justice and protect themselves and look after their own because they fear that no one else will. Reuters issued a report recently that said the Austrian army has actually had to pull back from operations and were confined to their camp because apparently firefights and clashes between unknown assailants is what the Austrian army told Reuters. So there's evidently been a degree of violence and a degree of tension on the ground.
Now, rescue is turning to recovery in Turkey and Syria as the likelihood of finding survivors dwindles 1 week on from that awful earthquake. More than 33,000 people have now died as the World Health Organization says the quake has overwhelmed everyone. Gabriel Gavin is a journalist in Istanbul. Good morning, Gabriel.
Good morning.
So hope's fading significantly for those still trapped in the rubble, but are operations still getting to people who are alive?
Well, so it's a really complex picture because charities and rescue groups say that the first 72 hours are critical to rescuing people trapped under the rubble, and 90% of those who do survive earthquakes are pulled out within that time. But actually, still over the past few days, we have seen a small number of really miraculous rescues, including, entire families being pulled out alive from under the rubble. However, with the freezing temperatures that Turkey's been experiencing, and the risk of dehydration for those who are trapped, this is becoming a really severe situation. And there are fears now that we're going to see very few people who've survived and far more bodies that are being recovered.
Well, you mentioned it's freezing temperatures in Turkey, and of course it is the middle of winter there. What are conditions like for the many hundreds of thousands who've been left homeless?
Yeah, so I mean, in the initial days since the earthquake, there were real challenges around where people could stay. Certainly, the people I've spoken to were seeking shelter in high school gyms. There were people who were told they couldn't leave they had to leave their homes and couldn't return because they were unsafe, but they weren't told to go anywhere. And as a result, they were huddling around barrel fires in the streets. That's now since changed slightly, and there's a huge provision of things like emergency tents being set up in sports arenas. People have been relocated to other houses nearby. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has pledged that everyone who's lost their home will have a new one within a year, and those who don't want to stay in tent cities can seek accommodation somewhere else, and their rent will be paid for by the government. However, there's a lot of criticism increasingly around that response that many say have left people without the support that they needed. And Erdogan is increasingly coming under fire for what people say is having turned a blind eye to corruption and bad practice in the construction industry that meant just so many buildings across this country collapsed.
Yeah, I'm interested in this. We know that Turkish police have already taken at least 12 people into custody, including building contractors. I wanted to ask you, is it dodgy construction that's partly responsible for the appalling death toll, or is this a political manoeuvre designed to deflect some of the anger we're now seeing directed at the government over its crisis response?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, actually. I mean, on the one hand, experts and civil engineers would say that there's absolutely no way that so many buildings across such a massive part of the country should have collapsed, particularly when most of them were quite new and ought to have been built in line with earthquake regulations. This is a well-known seismic hotspot, and people have been expecting something like this for quite a while. But at the same time, it's very easy to blame the individual contractors and the builders and say, oh, it was their fault. But actually, it's clear that there's been a system that's allowed Turkey to have a huge construction boom, build hundreds of thousands of new buildings on the cheap, and without anyone really asking any questions about, are they going to be safe if we have another earthquake? Are our citizens going to be safe in their own homes? And those questions obviously now coming to the fore because we're just a few weeks away. We're a few weeks away from a critical re-election battle for Erdogan himself.
Yeah, so with these elections looming then, is the president's future on the line after 20 years in power?
Well, Turkey's been grappling with a really severe economic crisis for quite a while now, to the extent that you've got 80–90% inflation. I've spoken to people who've had their salaries doubled and said that they're still worse off than they were a year or two ago. So there was already a lot of criticism of the government's handling of that economic crisis. And then you add this on top of that. And I think there is a real challenge for Erdogan to prove that he's competent and that he has the country's best interests in mind. And given the anger and the sorrow that people feel, I think this becomes his election to lose, really. And the opposition are yet to make political capital out of it or even decide who their candidate's going to be. But I think it's certainly going to be a tough battle for Erdogan, and he's going to want to do everything he can to cling on to power.
I mean, before we see voters go to the ballot, we obviously know Erdogan is not a politician who brooks dissent terribly lightly. Is there a risk that we could see some brutal crackdowns if protests gather pace?
Well, certainly the experts that I speak to have warned that he and his party certainly wouldn't want to see their power diminish at the ballot box. And we know that there have been irregularities in past Turkish elections. Just this month, I mean, one of the most promising contenders to Erdogan, the authorities have tried to ban him from the ballot on kind of what certainly outsiders say are quite spurious legal grounds. So there are challenges there, and there is often a heavy-handed police presence in Turkey, particularly around political activities, elections, rallies, this kind of thing. So I think it's certainly an election to keep an eye on in May, and we could see some really, really severe kind of political fallout from this earthquake. I think it changes everything.
What about the police presence in the earthquake zone? There are slightly worrying reports coming out in the past couple of days of looting and also other citizens sort of taking justice into their own hands, a rise in vigilantism as people are trying to sort of catch these looters.
Yeah, I mean, this is a part of the country. I mean, and this is an angle that's been underreported, I think, in the crisis so far, is that this is a heavily Kurdish populated area, and there is a huge amount of distrust between locals and the authorities. And actually, quite a lot of the time, local communities do a lot of their own justice and protect themselves and look after their own because they fear that no one else will. Reuters issued a report recently that said the Austrian army has actually had to pull back from operations and were confined to their camp because apparently firefights and clashes between unknown assailants is what the Austrian army told Reuters. So there's evidently been a degree of violence and a degree of tension on the ground, and it's really unclear yet as to how that's hampering rescue operations. But I think by and large, what you've seen in Turkey is that people, communities, authorities are coming together, maybe initially having been delayed, but they're certainly coming together now, and everyone's doing what they can. A contact sent me a photo just the other day of Turkey's far-right fascist party, a man wearing a bib supporting them, standing next to a man in the Communist Party bib serving up soup. So there really has united people across the political spectrum.
And finally, Gabriel, let's just touch on Syria. I know you've written about how Bashar al-Assad is perhaps using this tragedy to try and get Western sanctions on his regime lifted in order to get aid into the part of Syria affected. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, over the last couple of days, we've seen calls for sanctions to be relaxed against the Syrian regime to help speed up the rescue operations, bring in things like heavy machinery that up until now had been banned. The difficulty is obviously that those sanctions were imposed in the first place because of the brutal Syrian civil war and the fact that the regime had shown wanton disregard for the lives of its own citizens. So I think the international community is now looking at that and saying, well, can Bashar al-Assad be trusted to deliver aid to his own people, particularly when in the hours after the earthquake struck, as people were sifting through the rubble, his forces reportedly shelled one of the towns affected. The US has actually lifted sanctions to a degree and put a six-month moratorium on some of those restrictions. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult to see how the aid that comes through is not going to be used by the government to kind of leverage support in areas that are rebel controlled. And it's going to be very difficult to see how that aid can get through to this isolated region in the first place.
Well, we will see. Gabriel Gavin, a journalist in Turkey, thank you.
Thank you.